Welcome to the podcast for healing neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything from food, lifestyle, and medicine to nature, culture, and politics. There's no topic too big or too small. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine. And we have a really fun guest today. Dr. Arnold Eiser is currently a master of the American College of Physicians, MACP, an adjunct senior fellow of the Leonard Davis Institute, adjunct fellow of the Center for Public Health Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, and Professor Emeritus of Medicine at Drexel University College of Medicine. Formerly trained in internal medicine and nephrology, he has served in leadership positions in medical schools in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, where he published articles in peer-reviewed journals and was named as one of the best doctors for his clinical expertise in each city. He serves as a reviewer for Alzheimer's and Dementia Journal, Neurotoxicology, Neurochemistry International, Annals of Internal Medicine, and the American Journal of Medicine. He's the author of The Ethos of Medicine in Postmodern America, Philosophical, Cultural, and Social Considerations, published by Lexington Books in 2014, and Preserving Health in a Toxic Age, New Insights from Neuroscience, Integrative Medicine, and Public Health, which was published last October 2021. Dr. Eiser, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you very much, Julian.
So you have written a book called Preserving Brain Health in a Toxic Age. It is incredibly well researched. It was really fun to read. Your grasp of kind of the history as well as the modern social and political situation in which we find our brains was really, really fascinating to read chapter by chapter. A lot of work went into it, I can tell. So thank you for putting that together for us. But I'd love to hear, walk us through your experience, because one of the things that you recognized so clearly was that when you were in medical school 50 years ago, these were not the things that you were taught. And so walk us through kind of how you came to see this pattern that really, is not taught and is not really elucidated well. How did you come to this? How did you see all this?
Well, when I decided to write a book on this topic, I started reading the literature, which starting with the neuroscience literature. And the neuroscience literature on this has been quite progressive and fast-moving as it has, and it has left behind where the clinical research was heading. So, and as I broadened the scope of the knowledge regarding this, what became of paramount importance was the role of other organs impacting the brain. So the brain, as you know, is a highly specialized organism. It does have astrocytes that support the neurons metabolically. And it also has a specialized cells called microglia that protect against invasive infections and related things. So that it has a division of labor within the brain, but it is hugely dependent upon the gastrointestinal tract, which includes the microbiome of the gut and the liver. So the liver is the major detoxifying organ of the body. And I say that as a former nephrologist because the kidney would obviously has some claim to that role as well.
Uh-huh.
And what I started to notice fairly early in my delving into the several hundred articles that I read and referenced in the book was what I call Eiser's Corollary, which is that if a substance is toxic to the liver or to the kidney, there is an excellent chance that it's also a neurotoxin, even if it hasn't previously been described as a neurotoxin. That is likely to be the case because, and particularly at extremes of life, very early in life or very late in life, you have a situation that develops where the liver becomes even more important than it is in the rest of life because the brain, for a variety of these, cannot be as metabolically active as it needs to be to produce certain precursors of neurons. So there's one in particular, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, DHA, dexahexanoic acid. What was amazing was there's a linear correlation between it being low in elderly people and their likelihood of developing cognitive impairment all the way to Alzheimer's. I mean, that's pretty incredible. A serum blood level, we're not even talking about the level in the brain. A serum blood level can predict Alzheimer's.
Amazing.
Okay. It is amazing. So, I mean, one of the correlates, so there are relatively few foods you can get DHA from. Obviously, fish has been the leading one since time immemorial. Now, fish in the 21st century brings its own conundrum because many fish now carry a neurotoxin, namely methylmercury. So it is a very increasingly complex how to get enough DHA. When you're old and your brain, the astrocytes of your brain can't make enough, so and the liver may not be making enough, that you need to have it in your food source. So I think that's a crucial thing with regard to Alzheimer's.
Yeah, absolutely. DHA has been found to do so many things, address mood, even in midlife. And there's a medical group in Southern Oregon that's working with babies. And they did, I think it was an informal study, but they were recommending 600 milligrams of DHA for all pregnant mothers. And of the, I think, couple thousand pregnant mothers in their group, most of which were Medicaid patients. So this was not necessarily a self-selected wealthy group. Those who took the 600 milligrams of DHA daily, I think none of them had early labor onset. So all of them actually carried to term, which is unheard of in a lower income, stressed, marginalized population, but that DHA made a big difference. Yeah.
Does not surprise me at all. And is consistent with other articles that I've read as well.
Yeah. So those edges, those very young, very old. What makes the brain more vulnerable at those times?
Well, first of all, when the fetus is in utero, it's undergoing neurodevelopment, which is a very complex, truly amazing process. So if, for example, metals become contaminated, or the mother eats or drinks something that, or otherwise absorbs things like methylmercury, they can get in the way of the neurodevelopment. They can, and that's obviously going to have a huge impact on brain development. That is what happened in the so-called Minamata disease in Japan, where where mercury was dumped into a lake, Minamata Lake, and caused a tremendous amount of neurotoxicity, really across the age spectrum, but particularly in those infants who were born at that time during the contamination. So what happens is when you put organic mercury into a lake, the bacteria in the lake convert it to methylmercury. And methylmercury is taken up by human or animal consumption. And it is a neurotoxic in several ways. It can impair the microbiome. It can impair the blood-brain barrier. And it can promote reactive oxidative species and what they do, the reactive oxidative species, they cause the neuroglial cells to become activated as if there was an infection. So they're looking around to essentially attack something, cytokine production. And when there's nothing else to attack, they wind up damaging the neurons themselves. So you have a multi-tiered attack on the central nervous system when methylmercury gets into the body in sufficient quantities.
And can you talk a little bit about the difference between organic mercury and methylmercury, the different forms of mercury?
That's pretty simple. The inorganic is pretty much mercury by itself. And then when it gets methylated, a methyl group, CH3 added to it, then it's methylmercury. And then it's readily taken up into biological systems.
Okay.
As I pointed out, it took many years for this association in Japan to be made. And it's hardly like Japan's the only place where this has happened. It's happened many places in the world. And it continues to happen. Mercury is often a byproduct of paper production. So obviously the computer has not done away with paper productions.
Mhm.
And so we're continue to see mercury toxicity. And it's gotten, once it gets into the waterways, it takes on an effect all its own.
And so mercury, in Miyamata Lake in Japan, that dumping started in the 50s, kind of post World War II in the 50s. And then from your book, I learned, it really wasn't stopped until 1968. And so there was this extended period. And one of the complicating factors that you laid out so nicely was just that, half the town's tax base was this chemical company. And so here we have a whole community of people who are really in a tough catch-22. And that's, one of the things that your whole book is talking about when we talk about neuroscience and integrative medicine and public health is it's important for people to have livelihood. People need to be able to have jobs and work in order to make the money to, live and have housing and feed their children. And yet what this town was reliant on was this chemical company that was dumping the mercury, and that was hurting the people, hurting the elders, and definitely hurting the children.
Well, when there's a chemical company producing a toxic product,
mm-hmm.
there are obviously different ways of disposing of the toxic byproduct.
Mm-hmm.
Dumping it into the lake that people consume for the fish out of, that's not an acceptable one. So obviously that it would cost more to dispose of it some other way, but then you absorb that cost, and you may not employ as many people, but you may still be able to produce your product, just not at the low cost that dumping it into the lake produces. It's not a low cost because the society bears the cost of all the damage done to all those people. There were several thousands of people who were damaged by it. It's not a hard decision to say you should not dump it where there's a food source. But let's take this closer to home. Within the past year, about roughly a year ago, there was a report done by a congressional committee which found excessive quantities of toxic metals in baby food. Baby food. That's about the last place you want to see it. I mean, what kind of responsible industry would let that?
Yeah.
That it would have to be an industry that feels that it can get away with almost anything.
And whose priority is not the quality of the product, nor the satisfaction of the customer, nor the health of the customer, but really the bottom line, the financial gain.
Mm-hmm.
You make it sound really simple. I wish we all saw it that way.
I'm sure it's not going to be simple to implement because there are very powerful forces that want to resist it. But I think it's important to understand the sources of these problems are a type of thing where social values, ethical values do enter into the picture.
And so, as we were just getting on the show today, before we started recording, you were letting me know that you've been giving some talks lately at academic institutions. Is this part of what you're discussing in those talks?
It's not a major part of it. The talks are focused on showing all the different organ systems that have an impact on the development of Alzheimer's, other than the brain.
Let's go back to that a little bit. You include a great quote from Rudolf Virchow. Virchow or Virchow?
Virchow.
Okay, I thought it was Virchow. But you say epidemics are like signposts from which the statesman of stature can read that a disturbance has occurred in the development of his nation that careless politicians can overlook. So, right, he was an MD and a pathologist in 1848. So this is way before, this modern wave, this post-World War II wave of chemicals, et cetera, and this chronic disease epidemic. Can you talk to us a little bit about the epidemics that you're seeing and what you think they might indicate?
Well, the one that's been described as the canary in the coal mine is the incredible rise of autism spectrum disorder.
Mm-hmm.
It has risen to a remarkable degree, and it pretty much goes around to where there is the most likely exposure to a variety of chemicals. It's not just one chemical that predisposes, but a variety of chemicals. Now, the one thing that does stand out in my book, so my book covers a few different conditions, but with a focus on autism and Alzheimer's in particular.
Mhm.
And it turns out that there's so many of the toxins that are a factor in one are a factor in the other. Now, these two diseases obviously occur at very different stages of life. They also have very different pathology. They'd affect different parts of the brain. They affect different psychological components quite differently. But it seems like similar toxins have a role in each of them to some degree. And there are also, I have a second chapter regarding autism on the role of a commonly prescribed medication, acetaminophen, in the development of autism. And I am far from the first scientist to notice this association. In fact, in the chapter, I cite about 35, 40 different references showing very different lines of evidence. I mean, towards the end of the chapter, I notice that acetaminophen affects over 90 different genes that have been associated with the development of autism. So when people say, "Oh, these diseases are genetic diseases," they're far from where the genome is determinative of the disease. It's quite the opposite of that, actually. It's really having a susceptible genome and then having the environmental toxin presented to a particular person or that person's mother that generates a disease like this. And I mean, who has not taken acetaminophen?
Or Tylenol. Yep.
Or Tylenol. Yes, that's the trade name. It is the most commonly taken drug, not only in people who are not pregnant. It's the most commonly taken drug in people who are pregnant. So roughly half the people who are pregnant have taken it. So obviously, not everyone's going to have a child on the autism spectrum, but it clearly is a risk, and the mechanisms have been somewhat worked out of how it is a risk, and it does tie into having a problematic microbiome. It does tie into a liver that may not be functioning 100%, and it also, here's another important thing that I keep coming back to, is that whether a toxin is going to have a toxic effect is certainly dependent on your genetic makeup, the dose and the way you were exposed to the toxin, but also how strong are your host defenses against the toxin. And here, nutrition is incredibly important. So I would say nutrition is equally important to whether you're going to develop an environmentally induced neurological disorder will depend also on your host defense, which to some degree depends on your genetics, but even more importantly, depends on your nutritional status.
And I love how you talk about it's not even just what is eaten, but it's also what's uptaken. My background is really rooted and founded in an Ayurvedic approach to health and medicine. I learned Ayurveda first. And so they really say we're not what we eat, we are what we digest. So, and you talk a lot about the microbiome, including, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the cyanobacteria that are sometimes found in the gut.
Okay, let's come back to the cyanobacteria. Because they produce a very important toxin, enormously a toxin, called BMAA. And fortunately, most people do not have microorganisms producing that in their gut. If they do have that, they're in serious trouble because it is highly toxic. Most people get exposed to BMAA, well, one of two ways, actually. One is when they go out recreating on a lake or stream or stagnant stream that has BMA growing, cyanobacteria, better commonly known as blue-green algae. Here, the nomenclature gets a little confusing because while the organisms are actually a cyanobacteria, it has been the common name is blue-green algae. And to me, I'm not sure why they call it blue-green algae because it's really green. It looks like pea soup or
Yeah.
Guacamole, but it is a problem in most states in the United States. It's a problem in most countries, and it is a problem worsened by global warming, by runoff of phosphate fertilizer, agricultural properties from private properties where phosphate fertilizers are used, and not just from fertilizer, but also from organic waste of animals and humans that runs off into water. So BMAA, the connection to neurological disorders, was made by an ethnobotanist named Paul Cox and his team. And they made this connection out in Guam, which is an island in the South Pacific. And they connected it to the flying fox.
Amazing. As a food source, the people were eating, that's a delicacy.
Right. The natives consumed that. They got the neurological diseases, and they got 3 neurological diseases. They got Alzheimer's, they got Parkinson, and they got ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So it obviously is a sort of general neurotoxin that can promote this problem. And I've seen grow on local rivers where they're stagnant as well as lakes. I wrote an article about why there's such a high rate of death from dementia in Finland. Now, Finland, is it's a small, quite sophisticated country, very good healthcare system, one of the top educational systems in the world. So why are they getting all this dementia? So I looked at some of the characteristics of the environment there. They have a ton of blue-green algae, to the point that a scientist at the University of Turku in Finland developed a quick test. So when you go out with your friends to go boating, you can use this quick test to determine is what you're looking at. Is it algae, just plain algae, and then safe to boat in it? Or is it green blue algae and you should run the other way?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So obviously not everybody there is using it. So they identified 4 factors in their environment. Blue-green algae producing the toxin is actually called microcystin, but the chemical part is called BMAA. It's a form of an amino acid that gets incorporated into proteins, produces very bad inflammatory neurodegenerative disorders. So that was one. I was pretty sure that was a factor. The second thing was methylmercury. They have they've had a very big paper industry there for many years. So inorganic mercury has gotten put out into, among other things, the Gulf of Finland. And of course, the bacteria do what they do, but best, they turned it into methylmercury. And so that's number 2. Number 3 is, I guess you probably realize Finland is a pretty cold place. It's also an unusually humid place. So it's even humid there in the wintertime. So in the wintertime, the houses are well insulated, but they're humid. They have a significant mold problem in a lot of their buildings. So mycotoxins are toxins produced by mold. Probably one of the best known one is called aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is a known neurotoxin. Promotes activation of the neuroglial cells, producing neuroinflammation. It obviously can produce respiratory problems too. It's not just that. But so that was their 3 things: promoting neuroinflammation, and one thing impairing the host defense. And that is the soil there had a natural deficiency of selenium. So selenium is a key component of several enzymes that protect against a variety of toxins, including metal toxins, including organic toxins. We haven't even gone around to the organic toxins yet. But so if you're deficient in selenium, you're not going to make enough of the things like glutathione oxidase enzyme, which is very important in protecting against a whole host of toxins. So you have a weakened defense, plus you have plenty of toxins. Hey, no surprise that despite their excellent healthcare system, they're overall fairly healthy population, they're going to wind up with a heavy load of Alzheimer's. And also, one of the other things that my colleagues in Alzheimer's point out to me is you have to live basically a pretty long time if you're going to develop Alzheimer's. So some things are going right in your health. You're not dying of heart disease in your 50s and 60s. So now, of course, there are some cases of dementia that occur before the age in the 60s, past the 60s. So I would say environmental toxins may play even a bigger role there. So let's take the genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's. ApoE4, commonly known. What's characteristic if you have the ApoE4 mutation? You don't have any sulfhydryl groups that can grab onto free toxins. So again, it's pointing back to the fact that you have to have a good defense in order to do so. And also, while we're on the subject of ApoE4, people are reluctant to get tested for it. I think that's really a mistake. Because there now are so many different things you can do to help protect yourself against neurotoxicity. I mean, you should be doing them anyway, even if you don't have ApoE4, because you don't have to have ApoE4 to get Alzheimer's. You certainly don't. So you just might get it somewhat earlier if you have it. So that makes it all the more sense to know what you have and then to learn from reading books like Preserving Brain Health and Intoxication. But not just my book. There are a lot of other books out there that can help you with this. Dale Bredeson's An End of Alzheimer's is an important book in this area.
And that we offer his program here at our clinic.
I would say, finally, even the allopathic world is starting to catch on to this. They're finally recommending the Mediterranean diet, which I strongly agree with. They are, they're coming to it gradually, but a little slower than I would think. And the other thing that I think Dr. Bredeson has suggested, which I think is an excellent idea, is called, he termed the phrase cognoscopy as a battery of tests. While you have no symptoms or minimal symptoms, to see which are the factors that are causing the problem so that they can be specifically addressed.
Absolutely.
I want to draw an analogy now between Alzheimer's, an obvious neurological disorder, Bright's disease, which many people have not heard of because the term is of historical interest. But every disease of the kidney that was associated with swelling, edema, and the like, protein in the urine and the like. In the 1850s, it was called Bright's disease after the British physician who described it. We didn't make a lot of progress treating Bright's disease as long as we just called it Bright's disease. But what happened in the 20th century when kidney biopsies came into existence was we discovered it's not one disease. It's there are probably about 25 different versions of it. So as a nephrologist, I was actively involved in treating those glomerular nephritides. And we did it in a very specific fashion. Once we diagnosed based on some blood tests and some results of the kidney biopsy, what we were in fact dealing with. And also what were the contributing factors to causing it. So I think Alzheimer's has to go the same way. We're not treating one disease. We're treating, Dr. Bredeson says there are 6 different forms. I think there are probably more. I don't know how many different forms but there are many different forms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's time that we started doing what seems now to be kind of obvious. We have to look at which inciting factors a person is particularly susceptible to. I'll give another example. Homocysteine is a metabolic byproduct of protein metabolism, and it is a toxic byproduct. So the higher level you have, it can cause two things. It can cause, to some degree, heart disease, coronary artery disease, but to a much greater degree, it correlates with the development of dementia.
Mm-hmm.
So, and even the august New England Journal of Medicine noted this in a study 10, 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any rush to measure homocysteine and to aggressively modify it. I think there were a few negative studies
Mm-hmm.
where they lowered the homocysteine and it didn't improve anything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, if you're treating Alzheimer's in a late stage,
Mm-hmm.
you could treat with almost anything that would be potentially effective, but you're closing the barn door after the horse has run away.
Right.
So,
right.
So the stages where you want to really treat this condition is either minimal cognitive impairment or
Mm-hmm.
mild cognitive impairment, as more commonly known,
Mm-hmm.
or when there's no symptoms.
Right.
So we're not going to treat everybody, obviously. So where would we start? I would say 55. I mean, everybody's supposed to get their colonoscopy at 50.
Yep.
But not to interfere with that or to confuse people. Let's make it 55.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to be too late for some people? Yes. I'd
Mm-hmm.
say if you have a family history, if you have known ApoE4 mutation,
Mm-hmm.
do it at 50 or do it at 45 in that case. So if you have a family history or you have known ApoE4 mutation, do it 45. Otherwise, do it at 55 and then get very serious about it.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand,
Mm-hmm.
it's even good to start earlier than that.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting study from Sweden. In Sweden, everybody's medical record is in the same database. So they had the opportunity to look back at people who developed Alzheimer's. It wasn't just Alzheimer's. They also probably had vascular dementia. Vascular dementia is the second leading cause of dementia.
Mm-hmm.
So between Alzheimer's at about 65% to 70% and vascular dementia about 15 to 20%, you have over 90% of all dementia.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was that if you were a woman who could exercise at a fairly high level in middle age, so 30s, 40s kind of, if you could do that, you had a 65% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were a sedentary woman,
Mm-hmm.
you had a 35% increased risk of developing. So now what's interesting is that's not being measured at 55.
Mm-hmm.
That's being because of the enormous collection data that they have in Sweden, they were able to take that far back. So they're looking back 30, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I chased down the first author of that Swedish article,
Mm-hmm.
and I got her to pin down
Mm-hmm.
if you can if the female can exercise at greater than 120 watts, then I was able to then translate that. If you're an average size woman, you can run a 5K at under 30 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
then you're likely not to develop Alzheimer's. Now, what happens if you go swimming in a bunch of blue-green algae? Then I guess that's not going to save you necessarily.
The article that you wrote about Alzheimer's, these extracranial factors,
Mm-hmm.
it's so interesting because we can see that, it's the brain that it's affected, but then you walk through all these other sources, these extracranial factors, which is what you're talking about now. And that the blue-green algae, the BMAA, that inside the Alzheimer's brain, well, I won't spoil it. Can you tell us kind of what was found in terms of infectious disease and what we think about possibly the nature of beta amyloid now?
Yes, it's interesting that different researchers have found different organisms in the brain. And while these organisms sometimes can produce acute, very noticeable illness, what they're describing here is not that. They're describing a situation where the bacteria get into the brain. The bacteria, in some cases, fungus, candida. The bacteria include the bacteria that occur in your mouth. There's a particular spirochete that can get into, that's commonly found in the mouth, that some of the investigators found in the brain. The virus is a herpes virus, which was found in the brain. And so it actually led to a rather unique article that was published, I'm going to say about 3 or 4 years ago, where a group of about, 20 to 40 different investigators were sort of up in arms that why is this getting so neglected? So what it looks like is the virus gets there, or the virus or the bacteria, or it's not a specific organism, although some more than others. And they do, what they do is once they get in there, they sort of aggravate the neuroglial cells. And once the neuroglial cells start producing the cytokines, you have a neuroinflammatory disorder. So I think now, because beta amyloid turns out to have the properties of being active against all 3 types of organisms, bacteria, viruses, and the fungal, that the reason all that is going on, all that production of beta amyloid is going on, is it's trying to fight off an infection. Does that infection really exist? It exists to some degree. It's not a full-blown infection. But, because the microfilm forms, the bacteria doesn't kill you, or the fungus doesn't kill you, or the virus doesn't kill you, or make you very ill, but it gradually causes this chronic inflammatory reaction. In that sense, again, there's a very indolent nature to Alzheimer's. So people who have full-blown Alzheimer's, they've had something going on for at least 3 decades. I think we could find it and intervene before it happens. And the other thing, I think that's also, not only is that the most effective, I think that's going to be the cheapest way to do it in the long run.
Yes.
And by the way, pretty much every neurotoxin is also a carcinogen. So ideally, we should avoid them altogether. But let's be realistic. We're not going to do away with chemical companies because we have come to rely on them. But hopefully, we can reduce the degree of contamination that's going on at the moment. It's crucial. I mean, when we say autism is the canary in the coal mine, it also, that's hardly the only problem. I mean, there are a myriad of other disorders that are occurring to people in middle age, people undiagnosed, psychiatric disorders. I mean, the incidence of neuropsychiatric disorders in the United States has never been this high before. It's not just children with autism spectrum disorders or adults with autism spectrum disorder. There are so many different ones. I did cover somewhat the chronic fatigue syndrome / dysautonomia. I did put in, it has a very interesting history and how it's been described in the past. It was described in the late 19th century, early 20th century as a disease of modernity related to newspaper print.
Yeah, I found that remarkable.
Railroad. Yes. So, I mean, in a way, they anticipated the problems we were going to have a century later, but they were experiencing their own problems with it. Yes.
So really what we are seeing is exactly kind of the title of your book, which is that we're really under this whole umbrella. We're learning, we're having incredible new insights in neuroscience. We're finding integrative medicine can sometimes go places clinically and in the research or even in training where allopathic medicine has not necessarily gone. And we find that public health, when we're trying to figure out about what chemicals can be dumped where, when, and how, that we really have to take a look at our social situation in order to, our social and political scene in order to make the right choices for our society. And that it's going to take all of these things to really preserve and support our brain health moving forward, that of our elders as well as our children and our children to be born.
Let's talk a little bit about the different epistemologies of integrative medicine and allopathic medicine, because I think it's important to talk about this a bit. I just have to preface this by saying I was, to some degree, still am, allopathic medical school faculty. So how did I come to include integrative medicine in this book? Well, in a couple of different ways. It looks like the innovations that were happening clinically with regard to these disorders were, for better or for worse, not happening in the allopathic. So I could not ignore what was going on in the integrative medicine world because it did seem like it was producing some positive results. So some of the reviewers said that my book looked favorably on integrative medicine. Well, okay, I guess it does to some degree, but let me first critique allopathic medicine, because I think there's unfortunately a lot to critique. With 75% of the studies being funded by for-profit companies. That's all clinical research, roughly in the year 2000. And then again, in the New England Journal of Medicine, they said 75%. Professor Bodenheimer wrote 75% then were funded by for-profit companies. So that has a particular significance because the other thing that was happening with allopathic medicine is the development of this so-called evidence-based medicine. So the emphasis was being put on more rigorous clinical trials, which were larger, requiring a lot of funding, often placebo-controlled, which is problematic, I think. And particularly when placebo is hardly the standard of care for many illnesses already. So evidence-based medicine has really brought the randomized clinical trials to great prominence, and to some degree, rightfully so. But hardly everything can be subject to that. And B, these tend to be enormously costly. So now they're under the control of a for-profit company. So what is this going to do? The result that you're guaranteed is it's going to make healthcare more expensive.
Yes.
Because let's say, just theoretically, the thing you need for your illness is available for a few dollars over the counter. Is that research ever going to get funded? I don't think so. I'm not sure who's going to fund it. And the other thing is
a problem because, our government does fund quite a bit of research. And if our government, which provides such a huge amount of healthcare for our residents through, Medicare and Medicaid programs, if our government could save money, then that research could be very helpful. But there's never that closed loop. You recognized even in 2016 with Rick Scott in Florida, the governor of Florida, closing the beaches for the blue-green algae, the toxic blue-green algae, that it never went back to the fertilizer companies that were dumping excessive amounts of fertilizer that were causing it. So we close the beaches, we state the emergency, we never take it full circle back to the cause.
Right. But when's the last time a patient went to an allopathic doctor and the doctor said, oh, your illness is due to an environmental illness?
Yes.
An environmental toxin, or your cancer is due to an environmental toxin. It really doesn't happen. Okay, so let me just finish with allopathic medicine. So it's really bought into evidence-based medicine. And as I said, there's some good things about it, but there's some really bad things about it too, because it can study so little. And interestingly enough, allopathic medicine back in the 1970s, it didn't work that way either. It took the things from basic science.
Mm-hmm.
It then tried a small trial in humans,
Mm-hmm.
and it tried to see if it could develop a guideline based on these relatively small studies that didn't require a huge amount of funding. And sometimes it worked quite well, sometimes it worked less well. But that has sort of gone by the wayside now. And all the guidelines, all the clinical guidelines, have the heavy hand of big pharma in them to a remarkable degree.
Mm-hmm.
I covered this in my first book, The Ethos of Medicine in Postmodern America.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to belabor that here, but it is important to understand. Now let's go to integrative medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke to many of the leading physicians and scientists, if you will, in integrative medicine.
Mm-hmm.
The attitude towards clinical research is quite different.
Mm-hmm.
They would say things to me like, well, if it's working, why would we want to do a study? It's working for our patients. Well, I'm thinking, well, how am I going to convince a skeptical allopathic medical world that this works if I've got 20 case reports? I can't do it. I can't convince them of that. So I do think there is room for improvement. And the light that I at least imagine I see in this instance is the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. Mm-hmm. Is a new NIH center, relatively new NIH center, and it's now under the direction of Helen Langevin. And it does seem like it's making some progress in the direction of what I've coined a term, evigrative medicine, for evidence-based integrative medicine. Mm-hmm. And I do hope that grows to the point that we have more research that can convince more people. So not just people, but to convince key scientists key physician scientists who are writing the guidelines that there's something here and that's not just made up. But at the same time, I think it's important to have some rigor in your medical science.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I'm not always seeing it to the same degree I would hope to see it.
It's wonderful to have both. We can hopefully take the strengths of each and, kind of make up for the weaknesses of each.
Yes. Ideally, I would like to see that happen. And I think that there's some movement under that NIH center at the moment. So I do have a little cautious optimism. On the other hand, I think the needs to be aware of more than just what allopathic medicine tells you. Although I'm glad they've embraced the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah.
And I am a staunch advocate for that diet. I spoke to a group of dietitians in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, and I said to them that you can do more than the physicians of Pennsylvania to prevent dementia. And I meant it because the diet, and not only is the Mediterranean diet good, but the diet that's generally consumed is really bad. So it's not just that diet's good. Eating French fries full of acrylamide, that's not only bad for your brain, that is bad for the rest of you too. And it just goes on and on from that. I mean, if you go into a fast food restaurant, you're going to be seriously challenged to eat something that's not toxic. I mean, the food there tastes good. No one can deny that, but it's very little less healthy. I remember when Dave Thomas, the CEO and founder of Wendy's, had his heart attack, got some religion, and he put in these really good salad bars, which I gladly partook of. And, when Dave passed away, they disappeared. And, they probably were not very cost effective for the company, I'm sure. So, but because people weren't choosing them in particular. And I think we have to recognize that our natural inclination to eat fatty foods, to eat salty foods, and to eat sugary foods was of tremendous value when we lived in prehistoric conditions.
Mm-hmm.
When food wasn't always available, when it was available, we better consume it.
Mm-hmm.
And the fatter, the better, because that was going to give us more calories until the next meal was obtained. You didn't necessarily eat every day, but instead we have a food environment where not only can you get all this fried thing, but loaded with sugar, loaded with high fructose corn syrup. So it presents some unique issues for the human body. The fructose doesn't cause the usual aspects of satiety the way glucose does.
Mm-hmm.
It's also more inclined to be turned into fat than glucose is. Glucose can be stored as glycogen. That's not an option for fructose. Mm-hmm. So it gets turned into triglycerides, fats, and it starts you down the path, at least, of fatty liver. Now, fatty liver is a huge problem in the United States and elsewhere. 30% of adults in the United Kingdom have it, so it's not just an American problem, mm-hmm. but it is a dangerous thing too. Mm-hmm. It is advanced stages of fatty liver are the leading cause of needing a liver transplant in females in the United States.
Amazing.
It is. It's truly amazing. But they're not. High fructose corn syrup is far from the only cause of that. Mm-hmm. Obviously, excess sugar can also be equally bad. Sugar mm-hmm. contains fructose too. Mm-hmm. But the other thing are all the endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are organic chemicals mm-hmm. that are amazingly ubiquitous mm-hmm. in our society and other cultures as well. And you can get a dose with your fast food. You can get it sometimes in your water supply. You can get it in cosmetic products. Mm-hmm. It's easy to get, and then it's very hard to get rid of it too. So it causes endocrine disruption. It appears to have a significant role in the development of fatty liver. Mm-hmm. And again, we said if your liver is not working, it's not far for your brain not to be functioning. So that pretty much every liver disease, well before you have cirrhosis, well before you have that, you have evidence of cognitive impairment. Because again, it is an organ that's very dependent, that the brain is very dependent upon. The brain's also dependent, obviously, on the immune system. Mm-hmm. If your diet is poor in nuts, berries, vegetables, particularly purple vegetables or purple fruits, then you're going to have a weakened resistance against toxins. So I think there are many avenues that need to be pursued. People need to learn what are the common toxins that they're likely to come in contact with, how to minimize their contact, and how to maximize their defense against it. Let me take an example of selenium and nuts. Mm-hmm. Nuts are probably your best source of selenium. Mm-hmm. And the nut that has the most selenium is the Brazil nut. One Brazil nut gives you all you need for a day, maybe 2 days even. Mm-hmm. 4 Brazil nuts is enough to get you toxic. So here is I call it the disappointment in the biology of this type of issue. And that is every essential metal, copper, iron, zinc, selenium, manganese, they're all essential. We would not have human life or other forms of life without them. But each one that I mentioned, you can have too much of too. And they can be and they're all are neurotoxic when you get toxic amounts. So I think it's very important. On one hand, it's very important to have adequate amounts. It's very important not to have excessive amounts of those same things that are vital to your health. Mm-hmm. Now, we haven't even gotten into the vitamins, right? Mm-hmm. But there are a number of vitamins you need to have an intact immune system. You have to have adequate vitamin D. You have to have adequate vitamin C. To have a host defenses against toxicity, you have to have adequate vitamin E, right? All of them you can have too much of too. So it's important that people understand that having a balanced diet is probably the most important. But that's not to say there's not value of supplements too. But you have to be aware that you're not getting excessive quantities of supplements. The other thing that I think would be remiss to leave out are the spices. But not only do they make food more tasteful, not only do they make food safer because to the degree that they prevent spoilage, but they also are important sources of antioxidants. And probably none of them are more important than rosemary, like in rosemary and thyme. Those are probably, but if you're Italian, oregano is important. If you're a Greek or Italian, oregano is another one that's very high in antioxidants. And that brings us around to the issue of red wine, right? Well, of all the alcoholic drinks that may benefit your brain health, it looks like it's actually only one drink, and that's red wine. Maybe white wine a tiny bit, but it looks like it's all red wine. And the tip-off is the color, because it's the anthocyanins that colors fruits either deep red or purple that are the most salutary for brain health. Now, one of the chemicals that's been identified in this world is resveratrol, and it is true that it is good, but it's far from the only one in red wine. Now, what if your religious faith or other reason forbids the consumption of alcohol? Well, alcohol itself is a neurotoxin. That's hard to dispute that. In fact, if you're a consumer of red wine, you get the maximum benefit if you don't consume it every day. So your brain, your liver, they need some alcohol-free days. I typically say either 1 or 2 a week is preferable. It's superior to none. But if your faith forbids it, then there is grape juice and there's pomegranate juice. Now, it's probably advisable not to have grape juice that also contains high fructose corn syrup or has a lot of sugar in it. So you do have to, one of the advantages of wine is a lot of the sugar has been changed to alcohol. So it's not as much sugar. So red wine may be the most helpful, but that's not to say that properly prepared grape juice and pomegranate juice is very rich in the anthocyanins that are brain protective. Blueberries are very important. Green tea, the active ingredient in green tea, EGCG, is also a potent antioxidant. And there is at least one study in Japan that showed the people who consumed just two cups of green tea a day had a remarkably lower rates of Alzheimer's than the people who did not. So it's surprisingly difficult to get people in the United States to drink 2 cups of green tea.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a particularly good taste, but you can combine it with other things and get the benefit of it.
Might be an acquired taste.
Well, I mean, what I do is in the morning I have a black tea and I have a cup of coffee. Then during the day I have 2 cups of green tea. And then in the evening I have an herbal tea that's caffeine free. There are a few toxins in tea and even coffee, but it doesn't override the benefit of that relatively small quantity of them. And coffee is one of the substances that has a protective effect for the liver.
Well, we have really covered it today. I am so grateful for you to be here with us today. Any final thoughts you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think it's certainly hard to absorb all of this in the course of 45 minutes.
Yes.
In terms of preserving brain health in the toxic age, it's hard to absorb it all in a single period of time where you read the book. So I think books like that can be read and then used as a resource where you refer back to them. I've done that myself with my book. So it becomes a useful resource. And I have other suggestions on how to, one thing I didn't mention yet is obviously eating organic, because we didn't get into all the roles of the herbicides and pesticides in promoting neurotoxicity, and they definitely have a role. So I would be remiss if we didn't mention that at all. So obviously organic foods are going to be preferred in most situations. Absolutely. That being said, I have to also add, there's not a lot of research showing their superiority yet, but there is some suggestion that already that would make sense. The other thing we didn't cover yet is sweating. Sweating is something that ancient man did not have to think about much, because he had to think about how to replenish all the sweat. In our air-conditioned world, that is a somewhat different story. And also when it comes to exercise, sweating is an important component of that. So if you just go out for a walk, that may be fine for your heart health. And I certainly would never discourage walking, particularly walking in the woods is particularly good for your mental health as well. And but it's important that sweating be part of your life too. And that because the reason is that is one of the main ways the body has a means of excreting toxins that it cannot excrete in either the gut or the urine. So it is an important component.
Well, good last bits. Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening today with Dr. Arnold Eiser. We've got lots of ways to continue the conversation through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please be sure to share this show with your friends, and we welcome your rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And you can feel free to send topic requests to podcast@centerforhealingneurology.com. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together, and we're committed to doing what we can to make as many of us as healthy as possible. And this takes all of us, including you. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Partyfish Media. Partyfish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org.